Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, in my ongoing series talking about Baldur's Gate itemization, we're continuing to rate the helmets available in Baldur's Gate 3, which are the best and which are the worst for every character. In Part 1, I talked about the helmets available in Act 1, and in Part 2, the ones available in Act 2, so it will shock no one to learn that today we're talking about the helmets available in Act 3. The Act 3 helmets are some of the strongest items in the game, some of the most broken items in the game, and they're competing with some of the most broken items in the game that show up in Act 2. So this is a very heavily contested gear slot. By this point, you know the drill. You've seen previous tier lists, so you know how we're rating them and what criteria we're using. So let's just get right into it and start rating helmets. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Chris Dillon for the $2 donation, Joe Rundle for the extremely generous $50, Obamaclat for the $25, and Adrian Prishtoki and Terry Ernest for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support. First up for our Act 3 helmets, the Assassin of Bhaal Cowl. The Assassin of Bhaal Cowl gives you see invisibility once per short rest, so you can cast it just like the spell. You can also see in the dark up to 10 feet, which is honestly kind of insulting because all other dark vision in the game is at least 30 feet, so 10 feet of dark vision is kind of ridiculous. But in addition to those two extremely minor benefits, you also get +2 to your initiative. Obviously, the other two benefits don't matter at all by Act 3, but +2 to your initiative is still a massive bonus that any character can make use of. That being said, because this item shows up in Act 3, chances are pretty good that you've arranged to fix the initiative values of your party members already by this point, whether that be through taking the alert feat, having appropriate initiative gear, high dexterity, or using vigilance elixirs. The Assassin of Bhaal Cowl may not be necessary if you have your characters all have high initiative by this point in the game, which you should be striving to do. That being said, +2 to initiative is still a pretty serious bonus, so this can maybe let you swap out a piece of initiative gear onto a character that needs it more, or use a different elixir if you were relying on vigilance elixirs, or use a different item if you were relying on a specific item for high initiative. Maybe you would rather have like Viconia's Walking Fortress instead of the Sentinel Shield, and the Assassin of Bhaal Cowl can let you equip a different item in another slot if you were relying on that for initiative. Since this won't, for most characters, be your primary method of getting high initiative, but will be useful for some parties, depending on exactly how you're gearing, I'm going to give it A tier, because obviously +2 initiative is a very powerful effect, but by this point in the game, you probably have that from other sources. Next up, the Birthright Hat. This gives you +2 to your charisma. It says up to a maximum of 22, but that's basically not true because all of the other effects that increase your charisma and would increase it over 22 aren't capped. So, because of the order in which they stack, this effectively just gives you +2 to your charisma uncapped. You can reach up to 26 total charisma using the Birthright Hat and all of the story events that increase your charisma, as well as a specific combination of feats. Starting with 17, getting +1 from Anti-Ethel to 18, +2 from an ability score improvement to 20, +1 from the Actor feat, which isn't capped at 20, so we'll take you to 21, +2 from the Hat to 23, and +3 from the Mirror for a maximum of 26. This makes Charisma the stat that you can stack the highest in the game, alongside Strength, which only has to use the Cloud Giant Elixir. You don't have to do all of the work that Charisma users have to do to get it, but is still very powerful. That being said, the Birthright Hat does compete with a lot of other items for Charisma characters. If you are, for example, a Warlock or Fire Sorcerer or something, you will probably prefer an Arcane Acuity item, because it's basically +10 Charisma rather than +2. And for many other characters, you may want the +1 save DC and +1 initiative from the Fistbreaker Helm rather than just +1 save DC from increasing your charisma. So often the Birthright Hat will be very good for a bunch of characters, but slightly beaten out by a lot of the other equivalent options. And so I think in general it gets A tier. Obviously this is a very powerful effect. +2 to your charisma is incredibly strong, increases your Eldritch Blast damage, your hit chance with everything, but for a lot of characters that would want the Birthright hat, there actually are options that slightly beat it out. That being said, this is another one where if you just put it on a character that needs charisma, you're never going to be sad, because this is inherently a strong effect. It's just because this is such a heavily contested item slot. The Bonespike Helmet. The Bonespike Helmet gives you +2 to your intimidation checks, which is actually pretty good for a barbarian, because even at this point in the game, there's a lot of unique dialogue options for barbarians that use intimidation. Often they have relatively low save DCs, so you can have your barbarian sort of act as a pseudo-party face without having to invest points in it by having them make intimidation checks, and this item can help you do that. You also, when you enter Rage, enemies have to make a wisdom saving throw or take 2d4 psychic damage, which is a very small amount of damage and not a significant bonus for the item, but does add a little bit of extra damage on the first turn of combat. But the real benefit is that it lets you, once per turn, without spending a superiority die, use menacing attack, just like a Battlemaster fighter. The bonus damage on the menacing attack, because you don't have superiority dice if you're using this item, is equal to your proficiency, so it's +4 probably at this point in the game. So basically, once per turn for free, you get to add 4 to your damage and force the enemy to make a saving throw or they become frightened and can't move. That's pretty powerful. The ability to lock enemies in melee with your barbarian is awesome, and having the menacing attack to do that is great, and +4 to your damage once per turn is not bad at all. It's not the highest damage increase in the world, but it's definitely real and one that you're pretty happy to have. So overall, the ability to make a menacing attack once per turn is just a very powerful option that this helmet gives you. That being said, even though I have just spent some time talking about how good this helmet is, I'm going to put it in B tier, because the competition in Act 3 for helmets is just so fierce that even this item that would be a top tier item in just about any other item slot, I think is one that's relatively situational for a barbarian at this point in the game. It's a solid item that you can use pretty easily on a barbarian or any other melee character, and you won't be unhappy if you use it. But the other items, the other helmets available to melee users in Act 3 are so powerful that the Bonespike Helmet takes a back seat to some of the truly broken stuff that is an option. The Gibus of the Worshipful Servant. So I had to look up how to pronounce this word, because in Team Fortress 2, which I used to play a ton of, there's an item called the Ghastly Gibus, which everyone says Gibus because it's the Ghastly Gibus, so you say Ghastly Gibus, so it's alliterative. So I've apparently been saying this word wrong my whole life. The internet claims that it's pronounced Gibus or Gibus, and not Gibus at all, as I thought previously. Apparently, it's a specific kind of opera hat. The Gibus of the Worshipful Servant gives you bonus momentum equal to your charisma modifier at the start of combat. Momentum gives you 5 feet of additional movement speed per stack, and has a maximum of 5, so on any charisma character that has 20 charisma, this is plus 25 feet of movement speed on the first turn of combat. Basically, it doubles your movement speed. In Act 3, you have a lot of options to increase your movement speed, so it's less valuable to get this than it would be in Act 1 or 2, because of course you have the illicit flight if you're doing that, and a lot of other options for teleports and increased movement speed availability in Act 3. But 25 feet of additional movement speed is a lot, that's almost a haste spell, and will allow you to traverse some of the very large arenas in Act 3 much quicker, which is definitely a valuable option. In addition, it's a ton of movement speed for any character that specifically cares about having long movement speed, like an Elk Totem Barbarian who uses their movement speed to attack. And so that is a pretty powerful addition to that kind of character as well. Obviously, you need the charisma on that character to make use of it, so an Elk Totem Barbarian specifically won't be able to use it, but some characters care about having increased movement speed specifically. You also have advantage on concentration saves, which is pretty useful for any spellcaster. So on a charisma character, this gives you 25 feet of extra movement speed, advantage on con saves. That's a pretty nice package for an item. Again, on spellcasters, though, the helmet slot is so heavily contested. This doesn't give you an initiative boost. It doesn't give you a save DC boost, and those are the two things that spellcasters really want the most. And spellcasters, by this point in the game, have a ton of options for mobility. So the Gibus of the Worshipful Servant is a very cool and very powerful item that in and of itself is actually pretty nice. But because there's like 8 other items for spellcasting characters, all of which are excellent, it unfortunately is going to go into C tier, and that just shows you how heavily contested the helmet slot is in Act 3. The Hat of the Sharp Caster. The Hat of the Sharp Caster lets you re-roll the damage die on any spell attack that rolls a 1 or a 2. So basically it's the Great Weapon fighting style, but for spell attacks. So things like Eldritch Blast and Scorching Ray. In and of itself, this isn't particularly strong, because all of those will tend to have better ways to increase their damage output. Eldritch Blast, you can just add your charisma to damage multiple times over, so things like the Birthright Hat, or items that increase your hit chance, and of course, in particular, Arcane Acuity items are going to increase your average damage more than re-rolling 1s on a D10, 1s and 2s on a D10 damage die. And for Scorching Ray, a similar thing applies, where if you just want to maximize your damage, there are better ways to do that by increasing your attributes or adding additional damage, or adding additional hit chance, etc. with the Hat of Fire Acuity. However, there is a catch with the Hat of the Sharp Caster, which is that although it's supposed to only apply on spell attacks, i.e. spells that roll attacks, it works on Magic Missile. I don't know if this is a problem with the tooltip or a bug with the item, but rerolling a 1 or a 2 on a d4 damage die is actually a pretty significant increase to your average damage, because 50% of the time that's going to reroll the die and potentially get a higher number. And so the Hat of the Sharp Caster is a pretty important component of the builds that try to maximize magic missiles. Overall, it's not the highest increase to your damage output of magic missile items, and even magic missile builds may have better items for the helmet slot than the Hat of the Sharp Caster. But if you want to just maximize the damage of your magic missiles with an Evocation Wizard getting bonus damage, with Arcane Charge adding additional damage, and so on, then the Hat of the Sharp Caster will give you an increase in average damage as well, which, of course, when you're just trying to do as much damage as possible by casting a level 6 spell slot with a magic missile, is pretty important, because you don't want to spend that spell slot and not blow up the enemy that you're targeting. So for magic missile builds specifically, the Hat of the Sharp Caster is B tier, but most other characters that are making spell attacks are not interested in this, because they would rather increase their accuracy or increase their damage in other ways. And I am erring on the side of treating this as though it's intended and the problem is with the bad tooltip rather than it's a bug, but it's possible that in an upcoming patch they fix the Hat of the Sharp Caster to only work with spell attacks, as it says in the tooltip, in which case the magic missile builds will stop wearing this item. The Helldusk Helmet. So despite the appearance, the Helldusk Helmet requires no armor proficiencies, so any character can wear it, and it won't stop you from casting spells or entering rage or anything along those lines. And it gives you immunity to critical hits, which I've talked about how good that is in a variety of other items, and this, I believe, is the only way to become immune to critical hits without having any armor proficiency, so that's pretty nice for characters that want that but aren't wearing armor or don't have armor proficiency. Maybe you're a barbarian or a monk, so gaining immunity to critical hits can be pretty useful on those characters, and this won't stop you from using your abilities. It also gives you +2 bonus to your saving throws against spells, which is pretty good, because now you're immune to critical hits and really hard to take down from spells, so both physical damage and spell effects are now going to be quite difficult to land on the character wearing this. You also gain immunity to blind, which makes this very synergistic with a darkness party, because you can fight with impunity in Clouds of Darkness without having any levels in Warlock, so it's very helpful. And for a Shadow Monk in particular is really nice, because they can cast Darkness but don't have Darkness immunity, so the Helldusk Helmet can be worn by them without interfering with their abilities, and then gives you the ability to fight with impunity in your own Darkness Clouds. And you also get a spell, Immolating Gaze, which does 2d8 fire damage and frightens an enemy unless they make an intelligence saving throw. And if they're burning, they take an additional 2d8 fire damage. Targeting intelligence saves is always pretty good. A lot of enemies have very low intelligence saving throws, and frightened for 3 turns is a pretty good condition. So this can be useful for locking down an enemy in melee with your monk or barbarian, or getting your spellcaster out of dodge, but because it costs an action to use, it's one that won't actually come up that often. It's an okay spell, but more a if you're low on resources sort of thing, than one that's going to be a primary action. The main thing with the Helldusk Helmet is it's just a big pile of stats. Critical hit immunity, +2 to your saves against spells, and immunity to blindness all together are a pretty nice combination. But, as always, the Act 3 helmets are so heavily contested that the Helldusk Helmet is actually going to go only into A tier. This is one of the best items in the game overall, so again, I'm emphasizing this over and over. This is a really tough crowd for item slots, but critical hit immunity is better served for most characters by the Helm of Balduran, and monks may prefer the Mask of Soul Perception. So the Helldusk Helmet actually, outside of a darkness party, is not going to be equipped on every party, because you may want more offensive items on characters that want offensive items, and for characters that want defensive items, there's actually better options. And speaking of the Helm of Balduran, the Helm of Balduran. This gives you immunity to critical hits, just like the Helldusk Helmet, and also immunity to stun. So basically turns off the 2 most dangerous things for honor mode runs, the things that can most quickly turn an encounter from a comfortable one where you're doing very well into a disaster where suddenly you're losing. A character getting randomly stunned or critically hit is one of the things that can turn a good run into a bad situation that you have to run away from, and the Helm of Balduran makes that much, much less likely to happen. You also get +1 to your armor class and saving throws, and heal 2 hit points at the beginning of every round, which also triggers a lot of effects that work off of healing. So it's going to trigger a lot of the buffs from additional, the buff on healing items will trigger. So you can bless yourself with the Whispering Promise, the Reviving Hand can give you permanent Blade Ward, and so on. This is just the top tier defensive item in the game. It is if you want a defensive item, the Helm of Balduran is exactly the right one for you. It does need medium armor proficiency, so not every character can use it, but it is, again, just a big pile of stats, and in Baldur's Gate, a big pile of stats is exactly what you want. It turns off just about all of the worst things that can happen in a run, and also gives you a whole bunch of great bonuses besides. So even though this is a purely defensive item, and I tend to rate those lower, the Helm of Balduran is still S tier, because any character that wants a defensive option is going to want this one. The Helmet of Grit. The Helmet of Grit gives you +1 to your dexterity saving throws, and if your hit points are below 50%, if you're below half health, you get an extra bonus action. Extra bonus actions, of course, are incredibly powerful. Many builds will take 3 levels of Thief Rogue just for that feature, so if you're willing to invest 3 class levels to get something, you're almost certainly willing to invest an item slot in order to get that same effect. Extra bonus actions can be used for making offhand attacks for 2-weapon fighting builds, for making Flurry of Blows attacks for a monk, for making frenzied throws for a Berserker barbarian, or just for entering Rage as a barbarian and then jumping in the same turn. There's lots of great options when you have an extra bonus action. The downside of being at 50% health or below is definitely real if you're a melee character. So if you're a monk or a barbarian especially, then having to be at 50% HP can definitely put you in some danger. So just like the Cap of Wrath or other items that require you to be at half health, the Helmet of Grit does come with some real risks. But because this works on ranged characters and ones that aren't just making melee attacks, unlike the Cap of Wrath, the Helmet of Grit can apply to a wider variety of builds. Things like dual hand crossbow rogues can use the extra bonus action for an extra offhand attack, which can increase your damage output dramatically. An extra attack is just about the best thing that you can do for increasing your damage output almost always. It's more attacks is almost always better than bonuses to attacks, additional damage per attack, and so on, just because it's so easy to stack those things. So just more attacks is often the very best thing that you can get in order to increase your damage output. So the Helmet of Grit is one of the best ways to maximize your damage output in the game. Especially if you're going for like world record damage in a round or theoretically highest damage in the game in a single turn records, the Helmet of Grit will probably feature, just because it is such a powerful effect, and when you're stacking a bunch of damage riders and stuff, it's really good. But in practice, in actual play, it's pretty dangerous if you're not very confident with low health characters. And of course, the way that you use this item is to reduce your health to 50% before combat starts, so you always have the bonus and never heal up above 50%. So you will mostly use it if you're intending to burst down enemies in a single turn. That said, the effect is still just very good, and there's a lot of builds that can make use of this. So if you're willing to deal with the effect, then the Helmet of Grit is going to be excellent. I'm a little torn between giving it A or B tier, because the effect is really good, but again, the helmet section is just so heavily competitive. But I think that the Helmet of Grit, because the effect is so powerful, justifies the A tier that I'm going to give it. Because there are builds that will want this even over some of the broken items like the Mask of Soul Perception. The Hood of the Weave. The Hood of the Weave gives you a +2 bonus to your spell save DCs and spell attack rolls. Basically, this is an upgrade in most circumstances over the Fistbreaker Helm, unless you really need the initiative bonus, but in Act 3, again, you should have a lot of ways to increase your initiative, so the Hood of the Weave will often be more appealing than the Fistbreaker Helm in the very late game for spellcasters, because increasing your save DC is super powerful. Of course, it also competes with the Arcane Acuity items, but some spellcasters can't use those, and for those spellcasters, the Hood of the Weave is going to be best in slot, so S tier. Pretty easy one, because +2 to save DCs and spell attacks is great, so great item. The Horns of the Berserker. The Horns of the Berserker give you a +2 bonus to your attack rolls when you're attacking an enemy that doesn't have full hit points. And also, if you're not at full hit points, your weapons and unarmed strikes do an additional 2 necrotic damage. If you don't do any damage during a turn of combat, then you take 1d4 necrotic damage, which will then enable the effect of you not being at full hit points. Now, this does have the downside of being an attack bonus that doesn't work the first time you attack an enemy, which is typically the most important time, because that's when you want to land your powerful effects with lockdown abilities like Battlemaster Fighter Maneuvers or Monk Stunning Strikes or whatever. But +2 bonus to your attacks is definitely a solid option, and a +2 to your attacks and damage, if you are not at full health and they're not at full health, is just a great item. It's just going to be pretty solid overall. The downside actually isn't really a downside, it's there to turn on the additional damage, and 1d4 necrotic damage per turn is not a real cost at this point in the game. That being said, the Horns of the Berserker will not always be the best item, because characters that prefer a defensive item are going to want one of the more defensive Helldusk or Helm of Balduran items, and many characters that would want the Horns of the Berserker will prefer the Helmet of Grit, because an additional bonus action for a Berserker Barbarian or a Thief Rogue or something along those lines is going to be more damage output than the Horns of the Berserker will give you. That said, +2 to hit and +2 to damage is still very solid, so you can definitely use this item and benefit from it pretty significantly. I am going to put it in B tier, because I think there are basically most builds will have one other alternative that they will prefer, but the Horns of the Berserker are still an excellent item that you can use in a lot of different scenarios and not be unhappy. Jannath's Hat. This gives you advantage on persuasion checks and deception checks. Now, by the time that you get this in Act 3, you've probably made most of the important persuasion and deception checks in the game. There are still definitely some that you want to make in Act 3, and gaining advantage on them definitely helps. but you can get advantage on ones that are important by using enhanceability, and at this point in the game, enhanceability is such a low cost that you should be able to access that on most characters and be able to use it in order to gain advantage on those checks. You also, of course, can use the Friends cantrip to duplicate this effect very easily, which is available to a wide array of characters that would want this effect because it's available to all your party faces. So overall, Jannath's Hat gives you half of the effect of a cantrip that's available of a cantrip, and is also pretty easily duplicated by a spell without the associated risks of Friends. So I don't see most characters wanting this. You need to both not have access to a bunch of effects that duplicate it, and even if you do use it, it's not going to significantly impact your game at this point in the run, so D tier for Jannath's Hat. The Mask of Soul Perception. The Mask of Soul Perception gives you Detect Thoughts once per short rest, which is basically useless. Detect Thoughts is not a terrifically useful spell. You mostly use it to have something to concentrate on, and it's a ritual, so it doesn't cost you spell slots, so gaining Detect Thoughts once per short rest is not a real benefit. But it also gives you +2 to initiative, +2 to attack rolls, and +2 to perception checks. +2 to perception checks is okay. By this point in the game, traps are much less of a threat than they are in the earlier game. But +2 to initiative and attack rolls, those are great stats, and lots of characters need them, so any character that needs a bonus to its initiative and is making attacks of any kind, and because this works on spell attacks as well as on other forms of attacks, can benefit from the Mask of Soul Perception. These are just two stats that are excellent to have and go well together, because if you hit enemies more frequently and go first, then enemies often don't get to go second. So the Mask of Soul Perception is just a great item that pretty much every party is going to want to use on someone. S tier. The Pyroquickness Hat. The Pyroquickness Hat, whenever you deal fire damage with a non-cantrip spell, you burn yourself, you set yourself on fire, and gain an additional bonus action. The additional bonus action is capped at 1 per turn, but the burning yourself effect is not. So if you were to fire, for example, a Scorching Ray at an enemy, you would burn yourself many, many times over, and take a d4 of damage each time, but only gain 1 additional bonus action. That being said, for a sorcerer who's doing fire damage, an additional bonus action is great, because you can use that bonus action to quicken another spell, and so this can definitely benefit a lot of builds that are centered around that. You want some way, usually, to become immune to burning, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. One of the easiest ways is to be wet, so you can just take a shower before you use the Pyroquickness Hat. And an extra bonus action, like we talked about with the Helmet of Grit, is worth jumping through a lot of hoops to get. That being said, a Fire Sorcerer, which is the sort of most likely character to want to use the Pyroquickness Hat, well, the Hat of Fire Acuity is going to be best in slot for them. So the Pyroquickness Hat is only if you're doing some kind of non-Fire Acuity Fire Sorcerer, or didn't take the story event that gets you the Hat of Fire Acuity. It's still a very good item in that circumstance, but for the character that wants to use it, the Hat of Fire Acuity just absolutely blows it out of the water. Because although I said an extra attack is one of the best things you can do to increase your damage output, better usually than hit chance or bonus damage, when that hit chance is plus a billion, like the Hat of Fire Acuity, that math changes. So the Pyroquickness Hat is going to go into B tier, because the character that most often would want to use it has a hat that is just way better for them, but it is a very powerful option, and kind of fun that you have to build your character in such a way as to become immune to the downside, or work around the downside of setting yourself on fire to maximize this item. I think that's a cool little build puzzle. So it's fun to use, even if it's not necessarily the most optimal way to build the character that it's intended for. Sarevok's Horned Helmet. Sarevok's Horned Helmet gives you dark vision up to 10 feet, and up to 50 feet if you already have dark vision, and reduces the number you need to critical hit, so increases your critical hit chance by 1. It also makes you immune to Frightened, and the tooltip says, as well as other effects that affect your emotions, and I actually don't know what those are, if any, because you can still rage while you're wearing it, which is the only thing I could think of that really affects your emotions. Maybe calm emotions doesn't work on a character wearing it, If anybody knows if there are any other effects that are prevented by this in addition to Frightened, then let me know in the comments. But I haven't found any myself. The basic question for this item is, does Fear Immunity and permanent passive 1 increase to your critical hit chance beat +1 to saving throws against spells, +1 to constitution saves, and a slightly conditional increase to your critical hit chance on the Dark Justiciar Helmet, which gives you those things and a critical hit chance increase when you're obscured. It's very easy to become obscured, so I think that the fact that the Sarevok's Horned Helmet is a permanent crit bonus, whereas the DJ Helmet is a slightly conditional one, mostly doesn't matter, because it's pretty easy to trigger the crit chance increase from the DJ Helmet, because obscurement is easy to grab. So I think the only reason that you would want Sarevok's Horned Helmet is if you don't like microing to make sure that your character is in obscurement, or if you desperately need Fear Immunity. There's lots of better ways to get Fear Immunity in the late game, and I think that the advantage of the critical hit chance being passive compared to only very slightly conditional isn't worth it in sort of absolute terms. Now, I will say that if I have a character that wants both of these, I'll just wear the Sarevok's Horned Helmet because I'm too lazy to micro getting obscurement on my characters every turn, and the game's lighting engine is kind of janky, so it irritates me that sometimes a clearly obscured character isn't marked as obscured. But in terms of actual, like, mechanical advantage, the Dark Justiciar Helmet, I think, is just better than the Sarevok's Horned Helmet. For that reason, I'm going to give it C tier, unless you're lazy like me and just prefer the passive bonus, in which case you can just swap them out. It won't be a huge downgrade, though I do think it is a downgrade. The Scabby Pugilist Circlet. Well, forget the DJ items. Scabby Pugilist is my new punk band. Aside from that, the Scabby Pugilist Circlet gives you +2 to your weapon attack, to your weapon damage and unarmed damage if you're surrounded by 2 or more enemies. So it's similar to the Gloves of the Growling Underdog, triggers when there's more enemies on the field. You get +2 to your damage. This is just worse than the Horns of the Berserker, because the Horns of the Berserker also don't require any armor proficiency, give you +2 damage basically unconditionally on all of your attacks, and also give you +2 to attack on enemies that have lower health. So the Scabby Pugilist Circlet, any character that would want that would be better off with the Horns of the Berserker, and often any character that wants the Horns of the Berserker would be better off with the Mask of Soul Perception. So there's kind of a gradient downwards, and you finally land at the Scabby Pugilist Circlet. For that reason, I'm going to put it in D tier. I don't think that any character is going to want to use this. Maybe if you have a party that needs 4 copies of this effect for some reason, then you might consider equipping it. But it just doesn't do anything that other helmets don't do better. The Shapeshifter Hat. The Shapeshifter Hat gives you +1 charge for Wild Shape. It also gives you +1 to your nature checks, but like I talked about with the other item that gives you an increase to your nature checks, that's, I think, the least used skill check in the entire game, and +1 to your nature checks at this point is not particularly useful. +1 Wild Shape charge per day, that's nice. I mean, additional Wild Shape charges are useful. Normally they refresh on a short rest, but the Shapeshifter Hat refreshes them on a long rest, so you basically get a 7th Wild Shape charge in a day, or if you have a Bard, a 9th Wild Shape charge in a day. So overall, it's a moderate bonus to a character that's Wild Shaping a lot. That being said, I don't think that even though this is one of the few items that works when you're wild shaped, or rather interacts with a wild shaped character, it's actually worth equipping on a druid, because the additional longevity is fine, but you'd rather probably have a spell save DC increase or an initiative bonus on those characters so they can cast a spell and then enter wild shape, which is the normal play pattern for most wild shaped characters. If you intend to stay wild shaped full time and so can't benefit from those items at all, then you probably don't need the Shapeshifter Hat because you're not spending that many wild shape charges. You can swap this in for an additional wild shape charge, and use it if you run out. So it's not the worst to carry it in your inventory, but it's just not that exciting a feature. So I'm going to put it in C tier, because I just think that you can pretty safely ignore it. The Steelwatcher Helmet. The Steelwatcher Helmet gives you advantage on Constitution saves, requires medium armor proficiency, and makes you immune to blinded, and you can see in the dark up to 40 feet. This is basically a similar effect to the Helldusk Helmet, which makes you immune to blindness, or the Eversight Ring, or Shar's Spear of Night. So it lets a character who doesn't have Warlock levels fight in and out of darkness clouds without penalty. So you can be immune to blindness effects in your own cloud of darkness, and then enemies won't be able to shoot you. This is an alternative way to get those effects if you didn't take the story event to get the Spear of Night, or don't want to have that equipped, and if you need more than one copy of this effect in a party. So for a darkness-themed party, like my darkness-themed party that I did a guide for, which you can find under the Best Evil Party in Baldur's Gate 3, then you might want the Steelwatcher Helmet to make non-Warlock characters able to interact with darkness reasonably efficiently. That being said, this is very much the fourth tier of those 4 items, so only for a very specific party build will you use it, and even then, only in some versions of that party build. So I'm going to give it C tier because it does have a real effect, but it's duplicated by a bunch of items that also have a bunch of better effects, or use less valuable slots, or are available earlier in the game. And finally, the very last of the helmet in Baldur's Gate 3, the Pointy Hat. And what a glorious one to end on, because the effect of it is the glorious Pointy Hat. You gain a bonus to your persuasion checks equal to your intelligence modifier. Now, by the point in the game where you get this, as I've said previously, you've made a lot of the most important persuasion checks in the game already, so whether you gain a ton of benefit out of this is up in the air, and most characters that are actually making persuasion checks will have dumped intelligence, because most party faces that use charisma for something don't need their intelligence for anything. This can let a wizard make persuasion checks, and Gale does come with persuasion proficiency from it's selected as his human skill, and the game won't anymore let you change that, so he's always going to have persuasion proficiency. So if you're a Gale origin run and doing a bunch of conversations with him, or if for some reason you want your wizard to be a party face, this can let them do that at this point. And it will be a pretty significant bonus to your persuasion checks. So I guess technically this goes in C tier because it does have a use, even if that use is incredibly narrow. Turning a non-party face character into a party face might let you respec and save some resources on a different character that you want to spend elsewhere, but for the most part, this is not a massive bonus to your party, so C tier for the Pointy Hat, although it is, of course, as it says, glorious. So, summing up Act 3 helmets. Wow, what a collection of items. This, I think, is the act and item slot that I have been most sort of surprised by where I was putting some of the items as I actually went through and compared them to other items. Items that I use all the time ended up in B tier because there's actually better options. Like, I equip the Horns of the Berserker on a lot of builds sometimes, just because I like the effect, and it's pretty cool, and it's a very good item. The Pyroquickness Hat is fun to use, and definitely like a B tier item as well. The helmets in Act 3 are so powerful that even some of the items that are the best in the game, if any of these effects were on a cloak or a boots slot, then they would be one of the very best cloaks or boots out there, get relegated to B tier or even C tier, just because the items that are available are so massively powerful. By the end of the game, you are very likely, if you have a spellcaster who's not an Arcane Acuity user, to have the Hood of the Weave equipped, and of course if they're an Arcane Acuity user, they'll have one of those. The Helm of Balduran is going to go on whichever character needs to stay alive more, and the Mask of Soul Perception on any character that makes attacks and wants increased initiative, which is basically all of them. For additional critical hit immunity, you can add in the Helldusk Helmet, and there's a number of alternative options for various specific builds in A tier, all of which are excellent. And even in B tier, I would not ignore the items that I've placed in B tier here, because Helmet, like I said many times during this video, is such an incredibly contested slot that for specific builds or interesting combinations of characters, the B tier items are still going to be excellent, and you will not be sad to have them equipped. It's just that the alternatives are so amazing. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at every helmet in Baldur's Gate 3. I hope it has helped you in your build planning and will be useful in your honor mode runs. And of course, if there's anything that you think I missed on or disagree on, think I misunderstood an item or need to move it around, please do let me know in the comments. As I have mentioned in the past, I'm very open to moving things around, so I appreciate hearing your thoughts, and if you have a good reason to move something, we may well do it. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like button and leave a comment. Doesn't matter what comment. YouTube loves to eat those, to put those comments on a big pile labeled audience interaction and then show my videos to more people. So if you contribute to that pile, then it does help me out. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game analysis. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.